Hey everyone, Colin here from Node, and today we're actually going to be going through North Star metrics. So the idea is this would hopefully be a good primer on what they are, um, examples, how they fit into your company, and then just some general pitfalls and stuff. So what's this North Star metric? And North Star metric is this like beautifully simple idea that you can define a single leading indicator for sustainable business growth. And so the key idea is if you have this one clear metric that the entire team is aligned on, um, they can kind of frame their bets in terms of using that as a common language. So I believe doing this work was going to improve the North Star metric. Maybe indirectly, we'll talk about it in a bit, but they're all working in the same direction and they're all approaching it in somewhat of a data-driven way. And the key idea is, what does it mean to encompass sustainable business growth? The way we like to generally think about it is that it exists at the intersection of sort of how are customers deriving value from the product, what's kind of the product vision, and the key idea there is, as a team set out to build the product, what value props were they thinking about? Why does the product exist in the first place? And then ultimately revenue, and so how does the company at the end of the day scale their financial performance through that? Just to give you quick examples of North Star metrics, Facebook used to have a monthly active user North Star metric, and then they kind of transitioned it to a daily active user North Star metric as their company grew a lot. Uber has rides per week, and then Spotify has time spent listening. And I'm gonna go through the Spotify example real quick, because it's an interesting one. So someone who looks at Spotify could say, I mean, time spent listening, how exactly does that correlate with revenue? So the key idea is, with these sort of subscription business models, the biggest lever of growth, especially as a company scales beyond the initial phase, becomes retention and upselling. And so the idea is having, so in this case, since revenue is not directly derived from the North Star metric, retention is. And so retention influences revenue, time spent listening influences retention. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a bit, but the idea is all of these really do touch deeply on what the customer set out to do in the first place, and then what the product's there for, and how the company monetizes it. Um, Part of the beauty of North Star metrics is it kind of incentivizes present thinking over gap thinking. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times as companies set out to do work and they're thinking about, okay, what work do we want to do? They kind of set this desired future state, and a lot of times it's influenced by what our competitors doing, whether in our direct market or indirect market. And then, okay, how do we influence our desired state through that? Or a lot of times also through creative thinking from the team. But present thinking is kind of this idea of, we know how, if we have sort of one approach that both increases the value customers get as well as our revenues, we can use that as common language for our bets and for kind of deciding initiatives before we even go to bets. And so what you could imagine is, if Facebook's North Star metric is monthly active users or daily active users, you can really center all of your initiatives through kind of like this first principles approach of, how do we go about increasing that, rather than kind of using this not necessarily first principles approach of gap thinking. Um, Secondly, after you have a North Star metric defined, you can actually branch it off into some input metrics. And so the North Star metric is a function of the input metrics. And the key idea is, regarding assumptions, hypotheses, sorry, we are making assumptions across the board, especially as a smaller company. We're making assumptions of this North Star metric captures, customer value, product vision, and revenue. That's not always the case where you get it right in the first time, but we're also making assumptions on what are the input metrics that directly affect our North Star metric. I'll get into that in a bit on how it impacts work, but just do bear in mind that when you set out to kind of have North Star metrics at the core of the company, you also need to define some input metrics that the entire teams are aligned on. Quickly talking about context of North Star metrics and kind of strategy, it's very natural and even suggested to a large extent that as organizational strategy, product strategy changes a lot over time, it's also a good approach to kind of reconsider your North Star metric. I'll give you an example from Netflix. And so Netflix has evolved a lot over time. Their products evolved, their strategies evolved, and then their North Star metrics have evolved along the way. And so in the early days of Netflix, where you were just kind of ordering or leasing the DVDs through their website portal, their North Star metric was number of new members who added more than 3 DVDs to their cart in the first session. As they evolved and then launched streaming, it shifted to percentage of members who streamed more than 15 minutes per month, and then eventually, as they were expanding the streaming, especially globally, it was around total hours watched or hours watched per subscriber. So the key idea is you can see kind of how this is very strongly influenced by the strategy and challenges of the time, and more on that in a bit. But I mean, think about it. In the beginning, you're kind of inducing this new behavioral change of kind of discovering and ordering movies online, and that was kind of what the first North Star metric was about. Then you had this new behavioral change of let's get people to watch the movies online, not just order a CD or DVD. And then eventually you get to a point where let's actually make this something people love and consume religiously, and that's the case especially as you kind of scale again, as you become bigger, especially in subscription revenue business model. Retention becomes kind of the biggest lever of growth. Retention and account expansion becomes the biggest lever of growth, and you can kind of see that with Netflix how it's evolved over time. So one was focused more on kind of the earlier stage acquisition and activation, and then it became a lot more focused around long-term engagement, long-term retention, etc. And so again, with the North Star metrics, building on to the context of strategy and the business overall, you kind of need to start by understanding, okay, what game are we trying to play here? Are we in the attention game? Are we in sort of a productivity game? Or are we in a sort of transactional game? And so what are we trying to optimize for? Are we trying to optimize for eyeballs, transactional productivity? And I'm going to elaborate a bit more on productivity specifically, and then also kind of connect it a bit to earlier discussions around subscriptions and stuff, recurring revenue. So with productivity specifically, customers set out to do a job through your product, right? So if it's Dropbox, it could be having a common place to store and share data. If it's a dashboarding tool, it could be to report certain metrics, etc. And the closer your metrics are to the job to be done that your customer is going for, the more useful it is, and the better indicator it also is of kind of retention or inverse of churn. And so that's kind of the beauty of it. I'll give you an example. So let's say specifically we're talking about a dashboarding tool. And so with the dashboarding tool, the key idea is they sign up to report certain numbers. And let's just say it's a general dashboarding tool. We're not going to get super specific, but having a sort of unit, which is number of dashboards generated per user. And then from that, let's say we decide to make another metric. I'm going on a bit of a rant, not necessarily a North Star metric. And then we can create a sort of unit cost per dashboard created based on your subscription fee. That itself is a much greater indicator of churn than a lot of other things, because you're really getting to the root of what jobs you're trying to do. And so again, with North Star metrics, especially for a productivity app, we want to try to deeply understand what we're trying to do and the value exchange, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a bit. We're really trying to get close to the value exchange and capturing that. So going back to the revenue model as well. So is it a transaction revenue model, a subscription revenue model, or usage-based revenue model? Uber rides per week, very considerate of their usage-based revenue model. So how does having sort of a North Star metric and then defining the input metrics impact teams work? And this is kind of the ultimate idea, is how does it impact the organizational work? Again, it's largely about creating sort of a shared clarity and then intentionality when it comes to work. And the shared clarity is kind of this idea of, we all know that for us to grow our company, we need to grow these certain inputs that we've all kind of agreed that this is our current focus. And as you can see here, the inputs, the North Star metric is a function of the inputs that exist underneath it. And then going to intentionality, it's kind of this idea of we have these inputs and we can measure these inputs. What opportunities, and then within that initiatives, are we gonna kind of try to attack that we have the highest level of conviction that they'll have the highest level of output on the input and then the North Star metric ultimately. And so having that common language or common framework for thinking about things is kind of key towards growth, especially in a smaller company where resources are limited and you're trying to say, okay, from the infinite permutation of things we can do, what is the most important thing to do? And how do we ensure all the teams are doing that? And kind of North Star metrics provide, and the framework overall provides a really great way to approach it. And then more than that, it kind of allows you to track your kind of leading inputs all the way through to kind of more lagging metrics. I'll give you an example. Within each, so let's say you're approaching it this way, and so you're going, okay, this is our North Star metric, we have these inputs. From those inputs, we have this kind of conviction that if we attack this opportunity, it's going to impact an input, and then we have certain initiatives underneath that. And underneath initiatives, you have the work being done. And the idea is going through it in sort of a waterfall format allows you to measure each part and then measure how accurately it's flowing through to each level. It adds a lot more clarity and kind of data-driven culture to the work overall. Kind of final things on kind of tips and pitfalls on defining your North Star metric. Let's put this on the chart. So when it comes to defining your North Star metric, it's super important to make it actionable. And so this is something you can actually work on that's not directly out of your control. And so a lot of times, especially let's say if you're a real estate company and real estate's very heavily influenced by cycles, interest rates, etc., you really want to focus on what parts of it are within our control, and you want to have North Star metrics centered around that. At the same time, it shouldn't be something you can directly influence through one step. And what I mean by that is, if it's super simple to say, if I do this thing, it's gonna impact my North Star metric, or usually what that means is the North Star metric isn't really good for the entire org. It means it's more of an input metric that part of the organization should focus on, because the North Star metric shouldn't isolate certain teams or certain initiatives. It kind of encompasses the whole thing. Sensible meaning it's not necessarily a vanity metric. And startups are fairly good at this, but kind of more legacy enterprises that are focused on building out digital products sometimes struggle here. And what like for example, I was talking to CTO the other day, and I was asking, what's your North Star metric? And his answer was number of app downloads. And that's not really correlated, that's not strongly related to how much value your customers are getting out of it. You miss the entire sort of activation and then engagement that happens later on. A lot of them also focus on, page views, etc. These are very much vanity metrics. I think it's a good idea to be more sensible as to how it creates value for your customers. Finally, we have clear. And so the idea is, just as an example, so let's say we're a content company or a media platform, whether it's social media or something else, and we want to incentivize people to share content. And so it could be the case where our North Star metric is number of shares that happen. But that's a bit hard for teams to understand. And so something what you could define as, let's say, a frequent content sharer. And this is someone who shares more than one piece of content a week. And then your North Star metric could be number of frequent content sharers. Kind of things, pitfalls or opportunities when it comes to setting up your North Star metrics. Leadership buy-in and commitment is a huge one, because North Star metrics ultimately influence the way your entire company works. And so just having defined the metric and not having sort of buy-in and commitment from the organization and people, strongly vouching for it at the executive level, it's never going to take off. Especially because the work is usually done a few layers below, and if the push is not coming from above, it's not going to happen. So a lot of it's also on communication and change management, especially change management as it relates to changing a bit of the approach to initiatives and opportunities. And so a lot of times companies have, pre-made templates or formats when they have an opportunity they want to go for. Certain metrics they need to present to their superior when it comes to getting buy-in from them. And now you're changing that to sort of a new set of metrics. And so it's really important to communicate that well across the org. And then finally, culture and onboarding. And the key idea is you want to really get the root of the company on board. And when you hire someone, you have an onboarding document. What's our North Star metric? Or our leading inputs for that North Star metric? And really have them on board as to how the company grows, and then also what's the direction we're taking and with regards to opportunities underneath that. This is a very large topic. We can discuss a lot. I'm going to share some resources also on the topic. There's a great workbook by the team at Amplitude on this. I'm going to share this below. And then also, if you have any questions, email me. Our link's also below. You can reach out to me anytime. I hope this was useful for you.